Good evening and welcome here tonight to this session, which is going to be brought to you by the CEE Bill Alliance. The event is going to be live streamed as well as recorded, and we've got some fantastic speakers lined up for you tonight. Please, as we're going through, please send us your questions, which you can put either in the chat box or onto the various social media platforms that we're connected with. Now, the speakers that we've got, and they'll introduce themselves more when we get to them, but just very briefly, we are Caroline Lucas, the MP, Tim Jackson, Director for the Centre of Understanding Sustainability, Kate Rayworth, the author of the hugely influential Donut Economics and now an advisor to the Government of Amsterdam, and Kimi Naidu, who was until very recently the Secretary General of Amnesty International. Now, just a few words from me. My name is Rosie Boycott. I'm a crossbench peer, and I also sit as one of the founding members and on the steering group of Peers for the Planet, which we founded about a year ago with the very express intention of trying to get climate considerations into as much legislation as possible. So far, we have managed to get climate considerations into pensions bills, so all big pension decisions have to think about what their climate impact is going to be. We have about 120 members, and just from listening and knowing and being around, we've moved the dialogue. Now, have we moved any of the laws? That's another case in point. This is really one of the reasons, main reason as far as I'm concerned, why I'm here tonight and why I think everyone else is here tonight, because we're certainly going too slowly. And I'm always very amazed at the moment that the world of finance is moving much, much quicker than the governments, because they can see that so much of what they're investing in is in fact going to be a stranded asset in a few years' time. And that if you made a 10-year plan, which any sensible business, and you'd think government would too, an awful lot of the things that they have their money in are not going to be working. And the same is true of the government. So we really need bills like this, which will garner support, push people into understanding the emergencies, and hopefully get through.
Greta Thunberg famously said, "Act like your house is on fire because it is." Well, pledging to meet net zero by 2050, as our government has, is like dialing 999 and asking for the fire brigade to come in 30 years' time. You know, we need the fire brigade to come now, and that is what we intend with this bill. The bill seeks to build on the successes of the Climate Change Act, which was a historic piece of legislation when it was passed in 2008, and it's been emulated all around the world. But the bill also exists to fix some of the flaws in that climate change bill as well, because on its own, our current Climate Change Act isn't ambitious enough or comprehensive enough to bring about the scale of action that we need. The new bill, the so-called CEE Bill, Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, was the brainchild of the CEE Bill Alliance, which is a talented group of campaigners, including those who previously fought for the Climate Change Act. It's had input from scientists at the cutting edge of climate and ecology, and my thanks go to all of them. But crucially, this bill is a people's bill, the people's bill. It's sprung from the grassroots with the intention of giving the public a real say on the climate emergency. So in terms of the key points of the bill, essentially it would place in law a commitment to doing our fair share of keeping global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. And that means recognizing that as the first country to industrialize, the UK is disproportionately responsible for the climate emissions that are already in the atmosphere, and therefore we have a greater responsibility to move furthest and fastest in terms of taking action to address that. It patches the holes in the Climate Change Act by ensuring that our climate change targets take account of emissions from things like international aviation and shipping. At the minute they're left out of the Climate Change Act because it was just deemed too complicated to work out who was responsible for which bit of the emissions. Well, that's not good enough. And so our bill would introduce and ensure that those emissions from aviation and shipping were included, as well as our so-called consumption emissions, the emissions associated with all of the things that we import from other countries. You know, the government likes to say that it's reduced emissions by over 40% since 1990, but that's only because they've outsourced huge swathes of those emissions to countries like China, which manufacture products for us, which we then import. Well, it seems to us that if we're importing and using those products, the emissions associated with their production ought to be on our accounting sheet, and therefore our bill as well would include consumption emissions. When you factor those in, then emissions have only fallen by about 10% since 1990, not the 42% that the government likes to claim. So this bill brings a bit of honesty and responsibility back into climate legislation. It also focuses on nature, on protecting and restoring biodiversity, because we know that we face an ecological crisis as well as a climate crisis. The UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, with reports last month showing that the UK government has failed to meet 17 out of 20 UN biodiversity targets. It requires the active restoration of things like our vital peatlands, wetlands and woodlands, which are really important carbon sinks. You know, the government likes to talk about tree planting, but actually peatlands store far more carbon than UK forests. I think they store around 5.5 billion tonnes compared with 150 million tonnes from forests. The bill ensures that steps are taken so that the supply chains of products that we use in the UK don't cause environmental harm overseas. It calls for a just transition, crucially, for people working in polluting industries, because in tackling the climate crisis, we cannot repeat the grave errors of the past, leaving communities behind. And there are plenty of communities, mining communities, former mining communities, that are still struggling in the aftermath of coal pit closures because no provision was made to support, to retrain workers who have been involved in mining. We absolutely need to make sure that that just transition is properly funded and properly supported. The bill states we can't rely on unproven technologies to deliver on essential emission cuts. And overall, it ensures that our targets are big enough and bold enough in the face of the emergencies that we face. Finally, though, it goes further, because what it recognises is that real leadership when it comes to the climate crisis actually has been coming from people, not from government. They haven't shown the necessary boldness nor ambition, and they haven't engaged with people about how we build this just and fair society which keeps within our planet's environmental limits. And that's why this bill puts real power into the hands of people. It establishes a citizens' assembly to deliberate on the difficult decisions and to put forward a new emergency strategy. And it gives people real agency by making sure that it can't just be ignored, by forcing the government to bring the Citizens' Assembly recommendations to Parliament for debate and approval. So in summary, the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill is essential if the UK is to demonstrate real climate leadership and galvanise momentum ahead of COP26 next year.
Tim, why do we need this bill when we have a Climate Change Act, a government's environment bill, and proposed legislation on supply chains and deforestation?
Well, I guess that was the thrust of what I was trying to say. In a sense, we need it because the science has changed, our understanding has changed. We did nothing for too long, and now we are in a state of emergency. The emergency is different from the situation that we were in perhaps 20 years ago, 30 years ago when we first had the knowledge. Emergency means you have to act now, and acting now means creating the legislative framework to do that. That's what the bill does. And it insists on scientific robustness, it insists on fairness and responsibility, it insists on integrity rather than instrumentalism. It makes clear that we don't solve one problem by mass planting, plantation, forestry, that we have to respect nature as well as the climate. And nothing we have in legislation so far achieves that. That's why this bill is needed.
How will this bill prevent this siloing that we have, where we take one tiny step forward in one department and the next department rushes backwards several steps?
I think it will do that by bringing the future into the present. I think it will do that by bringing our responsibility to the future into the present. If you think that environmental targets are things that you can achieve in 2050, this administration is not going to do anything about it. No administration is going to do anything seriously, urgently about something that it thinks might happen in 2050. The science tells us that's not the case. The science tells us now is the time to act. And when you look at the scale at which you must act, then you begin to realize all the places in the economy, in society, that you have to take actions. And actually, you know, one of the most encouraging things out of a year of tragedy and loss is an understanding of the speed with which government can act when it needs to act. This is the same kind of emergency. Its timescales are very, very similar, and its effects may be even more devastating. So I think that's exactly what the bill puts front and center and calls government's attention to.